So that is working fine. All right, so now we can start building our form. So what we need here is 2 text fields and 2 date pickers. So let's go down in our VStack. I'm going to remove the text and we're going to put a form here. And whatever we put in our form, it gives us a nice visual effect of completing the form. So that's why we put everything in a form. So let's have a text field here, text field. And our text field is going to have a title and a text. The title is the name, like a placeholder that we have here. You can see it's name in our case. And the text, it says binding string. So we have to have some kind of binding string that whatever we type will be held in that variable. So this, for now, I'm going to create a state var name, and this is equals to nothing. And then we are going to have another for the amount, which is also equals to empty string. So now I can bind this to our name variable. All right, and now you can see it appeared. And if I duplicate and put this amount as a placeholder and bind this to our amount variable, you can see I can type anything I want. But for our amount, of course, we want to limit our typing options. We are going to change the keyboard for that. And we are going to allow only numbers because we don't want the user to enter any alphabetical characters for our amount. So in our text field, I'm going to put a modifier and say keyboard type, and we want to get the decimal pad. Actually, not the decimal pad, the number pad. So we want the numbers only. For our name, let's say auto capitalization disabled. No, auto correction, not auto capitalization style, and we are going to do every sentence. So whenever we enter something, the first letter of the sentence will be automatically capitalized. Right? You can add also autocorrect if you want, but I'm not going to do that. So we have the 2 text fields, and then we need 2 date pickers. Again, our date pickers will have title. So the first one is start date. Selection. Now we need a binding date, and in range, this is basically gives you the limit if you want to cross out some dates that are not available. So you can, if you don't want this, you can allow any date to be chosen. You just can get rid of that. But as I showed you the ready application, we're going to need that. So I'm going to keep this, and let me just duplicate this and do the due date as well. Okay, and now we need 2 objects to bind our start and end date. So let's go here, create a start date. By default, it's going to be a date, the current date, and due date. Again, by default is going to be our current date. So I will say this is binding on our start date, and this is binding on our due date. So the range. For our start date, we want to choose any date until today. So how we do that? We get 3 dots and the date. Initialize the current date. So basically what it says is if we had any other date before the 3 dots, it will make a range from that date until this date. But since we want to choose everything before our current date, we just don't put anything there. And for our due date, we will choose whatever the date of our starting date is. So we will say start date, and then all the way until infinity. We don't care what our user will choose as long as it's after the start date. All right. So one more parameter I want to put here. As you can see in UI here, we have an option of time as well, which we don't really need. So I'm going to say the display components, and then I'm going to get the date only. So you can see now it changes to the date only option. So let's do the display component here as well. And this is the date only as well. All right. So the UI is here. Of course, our button is not updated dynamically. So what we are going to do the next is to create a view controller for our add loan, and most of the things we're going to move there to tidy up our view, which is not related to our UI. So let's open our file here, and I'm going to create a Swift file. Actually, I'm going to choose SwiftUI, just a trick here because I'm lazy to type, but normally you should do the Swift file if you want to. We will say add loan view model. And the reason I'm choosing the SwiftUI file, that it gives us the struct here already with a name. So basically I will change this to final class add loan view model, which is conforming to observable object. We get rid of this, and we don't need, of course, preview. All right, so this is our add loan view model. Let's see what we need here. We need to, I'm going to take these 4 parameters from here and move them to our view model. And instead of state object, we are going to use, let me select this. We're going to use published var name and amount, date, and due date. Now, if we go back to our add loan, you will see that we have errors because we don't have these variables anymore. So instead, what we are going to do is we're going to initialize our view model. So let's say at state object, whenever you are initializing a view model, you use the state object. Whenever you are passing a view model to the view, let's say the view model is created somewhere else and you just pass it here, you use the observed object. So right now we're going to create it. So we are using state object var view model, which is of equals of add loan view model. All right. So now that we have access to our add loan view model, we can come here and just add that we want the view model name, view model amount, view model start date, and view model due date. And here we need to do that as well. And I think it should get rid of all the errors. And we can actually run our application just to make sure that everything is still working as we expect. I can type it still here. We can pick up the date. Everything in the future is disabled. Okay, 1st February, and here everything before 1st February is disabled. I cannot go back. So let's say 28th February. This is for 1 month. And Command K is our keyboard. You can see we have only number pad, while here we have our normal keyboard. So let's say this. Okay. So in our view model, we are going to write a function now that will dynamically change, return us if our form is completed properly, so that we can enable or disable our done button. So let's go back to our add loan view model. And here we are going to create a function. So let's say func is valid form, and this is going to return a boolean. Right, so what we need to pass if the form is valid, because our start and due date are automatically initialized, so we always get a value there. We want to make sure that the user has inputted a name and an amount. So I can say here, name is empty or amount is empty. So if any of them is empty, this is form valid will return technically true, but actually for the naming purposes, let's say is invalid form, because this makes our form invalid. You will see why it sounds better, because it says disabled, and here we are going to pass a true. So if our form is invalid, we will pass a true here. Right, so now I will just say view model dot is invalid form. So if this one sends us true, then the disabled will be true. If this sends us false, so it's not invalid, which makes it valid, then our button will not be disabled. Right, so here if this one or this one is empty, it will automatically send that the form is invalid. Let's test that. Run our application. So our done button is disabled. I put some name. Let me get rid of this name. And if I put an amount now, our button becomes enabled. If I remove, it becomes disabled. Okay. And our done button is also dismissing our view as well as the cancel button. So that functionality is working as well. All right. So for our visual things, everything is there. Everything is working. What I'm going to do is in our add loan view model, we are going to write a function that is going to actually save our loan when we create on done button. So here, let's create a new function and call it save. Let's call it save loan to make it more precise. So what we want to do when we want to save, basically this function will be called every time the user clicks on the done button. So let's create a new loan object and we are going to save that. So I'm going to say let loan is equals, and now we are going to create some kind of CoreData object, which is our loan. And so far we haven't done anything with our CoreData yet. So let's pause here and go to our CoreData because we need to create our objects here. So we have our persistent containers, persistent objects that we need to work with. So now I'm going to create both of our objects. We are going to have a loan and a payment type. So let's rename this one to loan. Okay, so by default we have this timestamp. I'm going to remove it. You can press on a minus button here, and let's create what variables we need for our loan object to have. The loan should have an ID, then it should have a name, it should have an amount, which is total amount, it should have a start date and a due date. Okay, now we need to put the type of each of these variables. So due date is of type date, ID is of type string, name is of type string, start date is a date, and total amount is going to be double. All right, so this is our loan object, and let's create another entity. You can create an entity by this button, add entity. And this is going to be our payment entity. So again, our payment entity is going to have amount, ID, and the date of the payment. The order doesn't really matter here, so you can do whatever you want here as the order comes. Again, this is going to be the amount is double, the date is a date, and the ID is string. All right. Another thing we need to do is to create a relationship between the loan and the payment object. So every loan can have multiple payments, but every payment can have only one loan. So if we click on the loan object here, I can click on relationship plus button, and we're going to call these payments plural because each loan can have multiple payments. And here we are going to link a payment. Inverse, right now we don't have an option here because we haven't created a relationship for our payment. But let's say whenever our loan has payments, that payment will automatically have its own loan object. So let's go back to our payment and create a relationship. And this is going to be loan single because each payment can belong to only one loan. And this will be destination will be loan. And now I can click on inverse and see that the payments. So our loan now automatically have inverse the loan, which is payment, all the payments, and it's linked